Hello and welcome to another video in the series Archaeology in Islam. My name is Dan Gibson, and today we want to examine a question that viewers have asked about the Battle of Badr. Those viewers who know their history well and their geography well have pointed to the Battle of Badr as proof that the holy city of Islam was Mecca in Saudi Arabia, as the descriptions of the battle could not fit Petra, which was way off in Jordan, and the battle site is clearly in Saudi Arabia. And I agree that this flies in the face of everything that I have presented so far. So their objections raise some very good questions. Now, I love challenges, so I have enjoyed working on this one. It's like solving a 1,500-year-old mystery, an ancient detective story. But first, I want to put this situation in perspective and compare it to what I know about the history of Christianity in the Middle East. In Christianity, even though there was a continuous presence of Christians in the Holy Land, the location of a number of important sites was lost over time. Some 300 years after the events took place, there was renewed interest in finding these lost locations. In 326 AD, Helena, the mother of the Emperor Constantine, left Rome on a journey through the Eastern Empire in search of places mentioned in the Christian scriptures. After her, a steady stream of women, as well as men, traveled to the Holy Land. When Helena felt she had found an authentic site, she dispensed imperial patronage for the building of churches on these sites. That means she used state money to build those churches. Eusebius, the theologian, notes that she established many churches and returned from her trip with a collection of sacred relics, which were then set up in Constantinople, not in Rome. When Jerome was pressured to leave Rome, he chose to move to Bethlehem. During his years of writing there, he wrote 2 eulogies dedicated to Paula and her daughter, 2 Roman aristocratic women who had settled in Bethlehem in 386 AD. They shared a joint interest in linking lost biblical and classical sites to their geographical locations, especially the locations mentioned in the sacred books. Today, many of these locations are deemed authentic sites by the presence of ancient churches, most built in the 3rd and 4th centuries. However, when we research history, we find that these locations are based on the churches that are there and on these women who decided that was the spot, some 300 years after the actual event took place. There's no proof that they are the authentic sites, but they are accepted by just about everyone as being authentic. In many ways, this parallels the history of Islam. 300 years after the events happened, writers such as Tabari tried to make sense and piece together the early stories. However, they faced an additional problem. While the writers of the Christian scriptures recorded many geographical references along with their stories and teachings, the Quran, on the other hand, has very few references. Only a few dozen geographical references in the entire Quran. In the book Quranic Geography, I began by comparing the number of geographical references in the Quran with those found in both the Gospels, the 4 Gospels, and the Gnostic literature of the time. I noted that each individual Gospel contains more geographical references than are found in the entire Quran. While this observation proves little, it does illustrate the problem that the later collectors of Islamic literature faced. The Quran simply doesn't provide us with much geographical reference. The Battle of Badr is a prime example of this. The later Islamic writers also discovered that when collecting the recollections of people who had heard something from someone earlier, details were often forgotten and the names of places were given without the teller knowing exactly where they were located or how they fit into the geographical picture. This struggle with geographical details is especially pronounced in the account of the first large Islamic military encounter with the Quraysh. This battle is often referred to as the Battle of Badr, or the Battle of the Full Moon. Even from its name, it is apparent that this is not the name of the place where the battle took place. It is just a reference that the moon was full at that time. Today, Muslim historians claim that the battle took place at Hunain, or the Battle of Nostalgia, this being the modern name of the valley that commemorates the battle. But even that name refers to the fact that people come to remember in that valley. The fact is, we do not know the name of the place where the Battle of Badr took place. Now, the engagement at Badr was important to the emerging Muslim identity. It was the first large army action, and it united the people who suddenly felt that God was on their side. So those who participated in the battle at Badr had special honor. While the account of Badr includes some geographical references, it also has its own set of problems. When writing books and articles promoting the Petra Qibla, I realized that the strongest argument against me was the location of the Battle of Badr. The records of Al-Tabri seem to present a relatively clear picture of where the battle took place, which corresponds to the location of Badr today, south of Medina in Saudi Arabia. It's almost like Tabri walked over to the battle site and then described it to us. Despite this clear description of the battle, there were no eyewitnesses of the battle when Al-Tabri wrote his history. Nothing had survived from the original accounts. True, Al-Tabri had a copy of the writings of Ibn Hisham, who apparently took his story from Ibn Ishaq, but if you look at the timeline, you can see that Tabri wrote about 250 years after the events took place. Additionally, everyone who deals with the geography of early Islam turns to Yaqut ibn Abdullah al-Rumi al-Hamawi. He wrote his book on geography about 1222 years AD. This is from Mosul. Yaqut tried to identify the locations mentioned by Al-Tabri and Ibn Hisham and Ibn Ishaq some 300 years before his time. But by Yaqut's time, which is over 600 years from when the original events took place, he had problems. This is why I refer to Yaqut, but only to see what he thought, because he's 600 years late and he's not an authority. Now, the earliest account we have of Badr is written by Ibn Ishaq, and he spends several chapters working up to the battle. He describes everyone who went there. He describes all the events that built up to it. Then he tells us all the Muslims that they had heard a caravan of Quraysh tribesmen were coming from Syria with a large amount of money and merchandise, as well as arms, and they were accompanied by some 30 or 40 men. After the battle, Ibn Ishaq spends several chapters telling us who died at the Battle of Badr. We get the names of the men involved, even many of the pagans, also the names of the 43 men taken prisoner at the end of the battle. But what is missing is the description of the battle itself. What happened to it? I think Ibn Ishaq wrote it down, but everything we know comes through Ibn Hisham, who later edited the accounts, and he admits in his preface that he omitted matters from Ibn Ishaq's writings that would distress certain people. So when Al-Tabri sat down to write his history, he didn't have the records of what had happened. So how does he get a history? This leaves us with a problem. The earlier accounts give us detail building up to Al-Badr, lots of detail after the battle, but it tells us nothing about the battle. So to get the story of the battle, we turn to Al-Tabri, who wrote many years later. So where did Al-Tabri get his information from? How can he give us the story from 300 years later when it was missing in all the earlier accounts? Well, Al-Tabri, He says he found an old letter written to the Caliph Abd al-Malik. Now, where did al-Tabri find this letter? How come none of the other historians knew anything about it or had access to it? Now, this letter was not an eyewitness account either. It was written some 3 generations after the battle took place. So where did that author get his information? We're not told. Now consider the timeline. You see, the Battle of Badr took place while Muhammad was still alive. After Muhammad came Abu Bakr. After Abu Bakr came Umar. After Umar came Caliph Uthman. After Uthman came Ali. After Ali came Hassan ibn Ali. And after Hassan came Muawiyah. And after him came Yazid. You get the idea? The time keeps rolling on here. Even after Yazid, he's followed by Muawiyah II, who was followed by Marwan. And after Marwan, now it's 10 caliphs later, Abdul Malik apparently receives a letter with information about Badr. Oh, this is around 700 AD. But the actual finding of the letter doesn't happen for another 200 years. It's lost. Then al-Tabri conveniently comes up with this letter. So he's writing more than 300 years after the time of the battle. All these caliphs have come. Petra has been forgotten. The original Mecca, the whole story there has all been forgotten. Now a letter surfaces, and it describes a battle that takes place in Saudi Arabia. And so today, you have people who go back to that letter and base everything they know on that letter. And so you can go to Saudi Arabia and you can find the site of the Battle of Badr. The description of the battle fits the landscape right down to there being a sand dune there. That leaves me to opinions. I can either accept the Saudi story and deny all the evidence I found about Petra and the Kaaba and the Qibla and everything, or I can look for the Battle of Badr in another place, where it fits the Petra story. You see, I'm suspicious of this letter, which al-Tabri so conveniently uncovers, and tells us such a detailed Arabian story. It perfectly matches the geography of the current location. That location, you go there, it has signs telling the tourists, this is it. And there's the sand dune. And there are upturned rocks that look like gravestones, but there's no inscriptions. It appears to be a graveyard. But for me, the letter surfaces 300 years after the battle. That's very convenient. My other option is to look for the location of the battle based on the Petra location. And you're going to have to decide between me and al-Tabri's account and the one that I come up with. You're going to have to decide on your own. Now, according to Ibn Ishaq and Ibn Hisham, the caravan set out from Damascus bringing supplies down to the holy city of Islam, which I believe was Petra. Muslims hear about it, and they leave Medina, and they head north. So they go north of Petra along the desert road, seeking to meet the caravan and loot it. That means we must look north of Petra. Now here's a map. The caravan would be taking the desert highway, and since the King's Highway is so tightly controlled by the Byzantine army, so they would move through the desert, and they would go up past where the road turns off to Petra, and the battle would have taken place north of there. What we need to do is find a graveyard along here that matches the number of people who died in the Battle of Badr. And that leads us to one location, only one. And here it is. It's called Qustal. It is the oldest Muslim graveyard in Jordan. It had an old square minaret from a very old mosque, possibly the oldest minaret in Jordan, possibly the oldest square minaret anywhere, which was later rebuilt as a round one. Forever after the Battle of Badr was remembered, everyone who had been there at that battle was highly esteemed. They were martyrs. Now, only 14 Muslims died there. So there should be 14 graves of the Muslims that were held in high esteem. So we're not looking for a large graveyard. After the battle, we would expect that a small mosque would be built there or something commemorative, and we would also expect that the mosque would face Petra, since the Mecca Qibla did not exist yet. And here in Custal, we find exactly this scenario. There is an old mosque, and near it is an old graveyard. Some years after the Umayyad Caliph Yazid bin Abd al-Malik, he came and he built a large house here, right between the graveyards. But some of the ruins there date to the Mamluk time, and some of the tombs even come from World War I. So you have to go and look at them and count them and try to figure this out. And what about the two graveyards? Many of the early tombstones have been moved to other museums, so it will take some detective work to find them and to see what's written on them. Some of them are in the Madaba Archaeological Museum. Some of them have been moved to the Amman Museum. Some of them you can't read, they're so worn out. But along with these earliest graves, there are also graves of people who wanted to be buried on this important spot. So how do we determine which graves are earlier and which graves are later? The secret to that is to understand how Muslims oriented their graves. For over 1,000 years now, Muslims have been buried on their right side facing Mecca in Saudi Arabia. This is what we would expect of Muslim graves all over the world. Now here's a photo of an excavated Muslim graveyard in Spain. But here in Custal, the Muslim graves predate Mecca and Saudi Arabia. These graves are oriented differently. Now, Christians are buried laying on their backs with their toes facing east, so that when Christ returns in the eastern sky, they will sit up and face him in the eastern sky. But these graves are not Christian ones. They do not face east. Some have suggested they face Jerusalem, and that's because the feet of the graves at Custal seem to face Jerusalem. Or maybe the heads do. So any Christian-influenced scholar would assume, well, these sort of point towards Jerusalem. But these are Muslim graves. So if the dead are buried Muslim style, they're lying on their side. And where do they face? When we draw a line from the side of these graves, we discover they face directly to Petra. And from our earlier studies, we know this is where the Muslim Kaaba was at this time. So how many graves at Custal are there like this? As I said, there are two different graveyards at Custal. A small one beside the Qasr, the large house, and a larger one in front of the Qasr. Why would there be two different graveyards? Is one a graveyard for Muslims and the other for the polytheists? If so, why did Muslims bury the polytheists also facing Petra? Was it a statement that they not only won the victory at Badr, but they buried the polytheist dead in Muslim fashion, not in pagan fashion? The smaller graveyard, closer to the Qasr, is of primary importance. If we discount the more recent graves, many of them dated, we discover about a dozen early graves. The number's hard to count exactly. To do that, an archaeological dig must happen. From the records, we know the names of the 14 Muslims who died in the Battle of Badr, but one grave is missing. If we read the early accounts, we discover that one of the men who died at Badr actually survived for a while, and he died on his way home and was buried at Safra. But he's counted among the martyrs at Badr. So there were 14 martyrs, but only 13 graves. And here at Custal, the oldest Islamic site in Jordan, we find two graveyards, one with about a dozen early graves, and the other with many more early graves as well. Is this Badr? We'll never know for sure until proper archaeological excavations can take place, especially of the graves that are there. Then maybe we'll find out. So am I giving you conclusive evidence? No. But it does appear that Custal could have been the site of the actual Battle of Badr. I suggest we'll never know until the faded writing on the tombs are identified. But the one thing I have demonstrated is that Petra is the holy city of Islam. and the Battle of Badr could have taken place north of Petra, and Qustul is the most likely place. I'm Dan Gibson, and this has been another video in the series Archaeology and Islam.